Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something rather strange and fascinating, how Egyptian mummies were carefully wrapped in linen. Imagine yourself in ancient Egypt, where the air smells of incense and the sound of delicate tools fills the room. A skilled embalmer stands over you, working quietly to preserve your body for the afterlife. Though let's be honest, you probably won't survive this process. They begin with the heart, for it's the seat of the soul. But before they even get there, everything else about you needs to be taken care of. Your body won't last forever without some divine help, and that's where the mummification process comes in. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is over there. I love hearing from you all. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of Egyptian mummies, you probably imagine wrapped figures lying in ornate tombs, but have you ever wondered how those wrappings came to be? Well, you're about to find out. And no, it's not as simple as just tossing some linen around. The process was meticulous, and every part of the body was carefully prepared for its journey into the afterlife. So settle in as we explore the art and science of embalming. As the embalming process begins, the ancient Egyptians are already thinking beyond just the physical world. They weren't only concerned with preserving your body, no, they were preparing you for eternity. The practice of mummification was deeply spiritual, linked with the ancient Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife. Egyptians were convinced that life didn't end with death. Oh no, it just transitioned into a different form. The body carefully preserved was necessary for the soul to live on in the afterlife. But it wasn't just about preserving your flesh, there was a whole ceremony involved. You see, mummification wasn't just for anyone. The wealthier, the more important you were, the more elaborate the process. Pharaohs and nobles underwent a far more intricate process than, say, the commoners, who often didn't have access to the same sacred rituals or resources. Historians still argue whether this elaborate process was rooted more in the belief of the soul's journey or in the desire for power and status. Whatever the reason, it's undeniable that mummification held great importance in ancient Egyptian society. Once the body was ready for the procedure, the embalmers would begin with what might seem like a gruesome step. They would remove the internal organs. Every organ had its own role to play, and none was left behind. The liver, lungs, intestines and stomach were removed and carefully preserved. Why, well, each organ had to be kept safe for the afterlife. But there was more to it than just preservation. Each was placed in its own jar, which would be sealed and buried with the body. These organs were considered vital for the deceased's journey through the afterlife, and the careful preservation was thought to ensure that the deceased would be able to breathe, digest food, and perform other bodily functions in their new life. It's fascinating, isn't it? The Egyptians weren't just preserving a body, they were preserving a future. They had specific rules for embalming that were followed with a near-religious dedication. Historians still debate whether the process of organ removal was as complex as we imagine, or whether it's the modern interpretations of the practice that have inflated its significance. Now imagine yourself lying on a stone slab, the air around you thick with the scent of myrrh and frankincense. The embalmers are moving, methodically removing your organs one by one. But this isn't a quick process. The whole thing can take up to 70 days, which seems like an eternity, if you ask me. Yet for the ancient Egyptians, this was a delicate, sacred task. They were not just working with the body, they were working with the spirit. Each step had a divine purpose, and while your organs are being removed, there's an even more important task ahead. You see, the body must be properly preserved for the soul to return and reunite with it. So after your organs have been removed and preserved in special jars, it's time for the next phase of cleaning. And not just any cleaning, mind you. Your body is carefully washed with palm wine and rinsed with water from the Nile. Yes, that's the same Nile that floods every year to bring fertility to the land. The water, considered sacred, was thought to purify the body, preparing it for the preservation process. But then comes the truly fascinating part, the application of natron a naturally occurring salt. This mineral was used to dehydrate the body, drawing out any moisture that could lead to decay. Your body would be packed with natron and left to dry for up to 40 days. This may sound uncomfortable, but it was necessary for the preservation of your body, preventing it from rotting away. Historians still argue over how much natron was actually used during the process, and whether the Egyptians knew the full extent of its dehydrating power, or if it was more of a happy accident. Either way, natron was a key ingredient in the whole mummification recipe. But it wasn't the only thing the embalmers relied on. They also used oils and resins which not only helped preserve the body, but also gave it a pleasant fragrance. Some of these resins, like cedarwood, were imported from far-off lands, showing just how far-reaching Egypt's trade network was. As your body dries and becomes less like flesh and more like stone, a transition is happening, one of profound spiritual significance. The ancient Egyptians believed that once your body was properly embalmed, it was ready to receive the soul back. Your physical body was now eternal, and the soul, having passed through the underworld, would return to it. It's a rather poetic idea, isn't it? But how did the embalmers know that they had preserved you well enough for this grand reunion? Well, they didn't really. They relied on rituals, prayers, and the intervention of gods, like Anubis, the god of embalming and the dead. This wasn't science, it was faith. And as modern-day scientists study these ancient mummies, they're still learning just how sophisticated the Egyptians' embalming methods were. As the mummification process continues, we now arrive at one of the most intricate and delicate parts of the embalming procedure, the removal of the brain. Yes, the brain, often seen as the seat of intelligence today, was carefully removed through the nose. Sounds like something out of a horror movie, right? But in ancient Egypt, the brain was not considered a vital organ for the afterlife. In fact, it was believed that the heart, not the brain, was the seat of thought and emotion. The brain was discarded often through a process that involved inserting a hook up the nostrils to pull it out in a mushy, messy state. Historians still argue about why the ancient Egyptians discarded the brain. Was it simply a case of misunderstanding its importance, or was there a deeper spiritual reasoning? Some scholars believe it was because the brain wasn't needed in the afterlife. The Egyptians thought the heart would guide the soul, not the brain. Others suggest it was a practical choice, since the brain, being full of liquid, would have decayed quickly. Either way, it's odd to think that the ancient Egyptians, who were so focused on preserving every detail of the body, left something as essential as the brain to rot away. Once the brain was out of the picture, the next step was to preserve the heart. The heart was carefully removed, cleaned and placed back inside the body, often wrapped in linen or placed in a canopic jar. The heart was essential because it would be weighed in the afterlife to determine if the deceased had led a righteous life. If the heart was lighter than the feather of Mahat, the goddess of truth and justice, the soul would be allowed to pass into the afterlife. But if it was too heavy, burdened by the weight of sin, the soul would be devoured by Amit, the terrifying crocodile, lion, hippopotamus creature. There's still a great deal of debate over whether the heart was always left in the body or if it was sometimes removed. Some scholars believe that priests might have taken the heart out during mummification only to replace it at the final stage of the process. Others think it was always kept inside. It's these little mysteries that make mummification such an intriguing subject for historians and archaeologists alike. The whole process wasn't just about preserving the body, it was a complex blend of religion, science and ritual, with every decision made to ensure a smooth transition into the afterlife. At this point in the mummification process, your body has been carefully cleansed, emptied and dehydrated, ready to be reassembled for its long journey into the afterlife. But the embalming process doesn't stop with just the preservation of your physical form. It extends to the wrapping, the final step that truly transforms you into a mummy. Imagine this: you've spent days or even weeks being meticulously prepared, and now the embalmers are ready to wrap you in linen. But these aren't just any ordinary strips of cloth. The linens are purposefully cut, measured, and layered with incredible precision. The linen wraps were considered essential to the preservation of the body and soul. Each strip was carefully measured to cover every inch of you, and the embalmers would even wrap your hands and face in special cloths. But it wasn't just about the cloth itself, it was about the significance of the wrapping process. The act of wrapping the body was seen as a ritual act of transformation, as you were being reborn, ready to join the gods in the afterlife. Every layer of cloth symbolized a barrier between you and the world of the living, with each layer offering protection and spiritual power. You might wonder, how many layers of linen were used? Well, depending on the wealth and status of the deceased, the number of layers could vary. Pharaohs and high-ranking officials often received the most elaborate and intricate wrappings, sometimes with dozens of layers of linen. Lower-class individuals might only receive a few layers, though even they were wrapped in multiple strips. Interestingly, the linen wasn't just for wrapping, it was often sewn together with resin or wax to help hold the body in place and seal it for the afterlife. The whole process could take up to a few weeks depending on the complexity of the wrapping. Historians still argue over whether the Egyptians used just plain linen for mummification, or if the fabric had to be specially treated with substances to enhance its protective properties. Some suggest that certain types of linen were reserved for the wealthier classes, while others believe that the linen's main role was simply to help bind the body together. Either way, the amount of cloth used was often remarkable. For example, the famous mummies of the pharaohs were wrapped in so many layers that it could take an entire team of embalmers several days just to complete the wrapping process. One quirky detail about the wrappings is that the ancient Egyptians sometimes included small symbolic objects or amulets between the layers of linen. These were thought to protect the soul on its journey to the afterlife. The amulets might include figures of gods or other sacred symbols, all designed to ensure a safe passage through the underworld. In fact, some mummies have been found with over 100 amulets wrapped up inside them. While it might seem like a curious tradition to modern eyes, these amulets were an integral part of the ritual, each one imbued with its own specific magical powers to ward off evil spirits and guide the deceased to eternal life. The most famous of these protective objects is the scarab beetle. The scarab, a symbol of rebirth and regeneration, was placed over the heart or in the wrappings themselves to symbolize protection and new beginnings. It's fascinating to think how much care and attention went into making sure that every detail of your afterlife was prepared, each strip of linen, each amulet, all part of an intricate system designed to ensure a smooth transition into eternity. Historians still debate how much these amulets influenced the daily life of ancient Egyptians. Were they used as real protection, or were they simply symbolic items to comfort the living? Some scholars suggest that the use of these amulets was much more than a spiritual practice, it was part of a broader system of magical beliefs. Whether they were meant to literally protect the soul, or just provide symbolic reassurance, it's clear that the Egyptians were deeply invested in the belief that they could control their fate in the afterlife through these physical acts. Now, as the wrapping continues, you're beginning to take shape as something more than just a body. You're becoming a spiritual vessel for the afterlife. But here's the thing, the linen, while important, was far from the only material that the embalmers used. In fact, one of the most crucial steps in the process was the use of resins and oils, which served both practical and symbolic functions. These sticky aromatic substances weren't just for smell, they were essential for preserving the body and sealing it from the decay that could threaten your journey to the afterlife. As you lie there on the embalming table, layers of linen begin to wrap around you, but every so often the embalmers pause to apply a layer of resin or oil. Think of it like applying a protective coat of varnish to a valuable piece of furniture. Each layer serves a protective purpose. These resins were often derived from trees like pine or cedar, and their fragrant, sticky nature helped to preserve your body by filling in the gaps between the layers of linen, effectively sealing the body from air and moisture. The use of these oils and resins goes back to ancient trade routes. Egypt's access to the Mediterranean and beyond meant that resins from as far away as Lebanon were commonly used. The cedar wood resin from Lebanon in particular was highly prized. But it wasn't just about preservation, it also had a spiritual role. The fragrant oils and resins used in the mummification process were believed to carry divine significance, helping the deceased to be fragrant and presentable to the gods. These resins also acted as a sort of spiritual barrier, preventing the body from being defiled by evil forces during its time in the tomb. Historians still debate whether the embalming oils had any real scientific merit in preserving the body, or whether they were simply another layer of ritual and symbolism. Some researchers believe that these oils had a significant preservative effect, while others argue that their main purpose was to provide a more pleasing aroma to the embalming process. Either way, the resins and oils were an essential part of the ancient Egyptian embalming formula. A quirky tidbit that might catch your attention is that the use of these oils wasn't just confined to mummification. In fact, many of the same resins and oils that were used to preserve bodies were also used in everyday life. These oils were highly prized for their use in cosmetics, perfumes, and even in religious ceremonies. In fact, it was not uncommon for the ancient Egyptians to carry small vials of precious oils with them, not just for personal hygiene, but as a symbol of wealth and status. Imagine this as your body is being prepared for the afterlife. You're not just getting wrapped in linen, your very scent is being carefully crafted, and that scent will accompany you for all eternity. That's a pretty big deal when you think about it. As the embalming ritual winds down every step from the oils to the resins to the wrapping is helping you transition from the physical world to the divine. And yet it wasn't just about the materials themselves. The embalmers also chanted prayers and incantations to invoke the gods, ensuring that your spirit would have a safe passage. Historians have long speculated about the true significance of these prayers. Were they just ceremonial acts, or did the ancient Egyptians believe that the spoken word itself could influence the gods? While some scholars argue that these prayers were essential in guiding the soul to the afterlife, others suggest that they were more about reinforcing the belief that the afterlife was attainable and safe after all. It's one thing to preserve a body, and another to ensure the soul was prepared for what came next. As the final layers of linen are wrapped around you, it's hard to ignore the sheer dedication of the embalmers. With every wrap, every prayer, they're not just preparing your body, they're preparing your soul for its next phase. Once the body has been sealed in its intricate layers of linen, it's not just put away in a tomb and forgotten. No, there's a significant ritual involved in securing the body for the afterlife. The next crucial step in this process is the addition of the amulets and charms, which are embedded between the layers of linen, placed carefully at specific spots on the body. These aren't just trinkets, they're powerful talismans meant to protect the body from evil spirits and ensure the soul's safe passage through the afterlife. The most famous of these charms is the scarab beetle, an ancient symbol of regeneration, transformation, and rebirth. The scarab beetle was often placed over the heart or in the wrappings of the body to provide protection against the dangers of the underworld. The heart, after all, was considered the seat of emotion and intellect, so the scarab had to guard it carefully. But the scarab wasn't the only amulet. There were dozens of others, each one representing a different god or spirit designed to ward off evil and help the deceased navigate the perilous journey to the afterlife. Interestingly, these amulets were often inscribed with magical texts such as the spells found in the Book of the Dead, a guide to the afterlife. The spells were designed to ensure that the deceased would be protected from the dangers of the underworld and would be able to pass through the trials of the afterlife unscathed. It's fascinating to think that these seemingly simple charms were viewed as necessary for eternal peace. But here's the thing, historians still argue over how much these amulets were actually believed to work in the spiritual sense. Some scholars believe that the amulets were purely symbolic, comforting the living who believed in the power of magic. Others argue that they were thought to offer real tangible protection for the deceased soul. Either way, the ritual of placing amulets between the linen was seen as an essential part of mummification. These rituals weren't just for the pharaohs or the wealthy either. Even the commoners were provided with amulets, albeit perhaps less elaborate ones. The Egyptians truly believed in the power of these protective charms, and this practice continued throughout much of their history. In fact, when archaeologists first began uncovering tombs and mummies in the 19th and 20th centuries, They found hundreds of these amulets, some of which had never been seen before, leading to exciting new discoveries about ancient Egyptian beliefs and practices. A quirky tidbit about these amulets is that they were often crafted with materials that were symbolic of divine power, such as gold turquoise and lapis lazuli. These precious stones were believed to carry magical properties of their own, further strengthening the protection they provided. The intricate designs and vivid colours of the amulets would have been a sight to behold, and it's easy to imagine how these small objects might have brought a sense of security to both the living and the deceased. Historians still argue about how much these amulets truly influenced the lives of the ancient Egyptians, or whether they were simply a ritualistic formality. Did they believe in their power to protect the soul, or were they just another layer of comfort, a way to ensure that the dead were not left alone in the afterlife? We may never know for sure, but one thing is clear. Amulets played a crucial role in the mummification process, giving the deceased a little extra bit of divine protection to carry them through eternity. As the mummification process draws to a close, you are nearly ready to be laid to rest. The body, wrapped and carefully preserved, is now sealed with protective charms and anointed with oils. The final layers of linen have been applied, the prayers and incantations uttered. But your journey into the afterlife isn't complete just yet. You need one last significant step: the creation of the burial chamber. This is where your mummified form will spend eternity secure, safe, and protected from the world of the living. But the process of preparing you for the tomb is a story in itself. The tomb is not just a place to store the body, it is considered a sanctuary, a sacred space that will protect you in your eternal journey. Egyptian tombs, especially for those of high rank, were elaborate constructions designed not just for the preservation of the body, but for the spiritual success of the soul. The tombs were filled with offerings, food, water, and items needed for the afterlife. Everything from tools to luxury items meant to accompany the deceased on their journey. Some tombs were filled with servants and treasures intended to ensure that the soul would want for nothing once it crossed into the next world. Interestingly, the exact nature of the burial chamber and its contents was influenced by both wealth and social status. The higher your rank in society, the more elaborate your tomb. Pharaohs, for example, were buried in massive pyramid tombs, surrounded by vast treasures and protective spells. Nobles and high-ranking officials had tombs filled with intricately carved stone and an array of precious items. Commoners, on the other hand, often had simpler tombs, sometimes just a small unadorned pit. Yet even for the common folk, these tombs were designed to ensure a safe passage to the afterlife. Historians still debate how much the ancient Egyptians believed that the tomb itself could offer protection. Some argue that it was not just the body, but the tomb and its contents that played a key role in the deceased's success in the afterlife. The tomb was essentially a reflection of the living world, a place where the deceased could rest and continue their existence, surrounded by things they had enjoyed in life. The tomb was considered a realm of transition, a place where the dead could be reborn into the afterlife. There's something quite serene about the idea of these tombs filled with mummies' treasures and sacred objects standing as silent sentinels against the world's wear and tear. The tombs were built to last forever, and some of them have indeed stood the test of time. The pyramids, for example, have lasted for thousands of years, and within them the mummies still rest, their bodies preserved and surrounded by the same rituals that were once designed to help them reach eternal peace. But even beyond the material, the Egyptians were concerned with the spiritual care of their deceased. The tomb, of course, wasn't just about the physical care of the body, it was also about ensuring that the soul could return to its body in the afterlife. In fact, some tombs had inscriptions or paintings on the walls which showed scenes of the deceased performing activities they had enjoyed in life, such as hunting, fishing, or feasting. These depictions were meant to serve as reminders of the living world and to help guide the soul on its journey. But here's a curious thought: even though these tombs were meant to protect and preserve, not all mummies made it to their resting places as planned. In some cases, tombs were robbed, looted, and desecrated, a problem that plagued even the most elaborate royal tombs. Historians still debate the reasons behind tomb robberies. Some suggest it was greed, while others argue that tomb robbers believed they were doing the deceased a service removing the dead's possessions so they could move on peacefully. Once the mummified body has been securely placed in its tomb, the final steps of the burial ritual begin. The tomb is sealed, and the burial chamber becomes a resting place for the soul's journey into the afterlife. But the embalming and mummification process wasn't the only thing the Egyptians had to worry about. They also believed in the power of offerings and rituals to ensure that the deceased had everything they needed for eternity. And that's where the fascinating and sometimes strange world of funerary practices comes in. The ancient Egyptians believed that the soul needed to be fed and cared for in the afterlife, just as it did in life. This belief led to the custom of placing food, drink, and other items in the tomb. Offerings ranged from simple items like bread and beer to more elaborate gifts such as statues and jewellery. These offerings were meant to sustain the soul during its journey through the underworld, and they often reflected the deceased's status and wealth. For example, a wealthy noble might have had an abundance of food and luxurious items placed in their tomb, while a commoner's offerings were more modest. But there was more to these offerings than just the physical gifts. In addition to tangible items, the Egyptians also performed rituals to ensure the soul's safety and comfort. One of the most important rituals was the opening of the mouth ceremony, a key part of the burial process. The ceremony involved a priest using a ceremonial instrument to symbolically open the deceased's mouth and eyes so that they could eat, drink, and speak in the afterlife. This ritual was meant to ensure that the deceased could enjoy all the comforts of the afterlife and participate in the world of the living. Historians still debate the significance of the opening of the mouth ceremony. Some believe it was purely symbolic, a way for the living to perform one last act of kindness for the deceased. Others suggest that it was an essential ritual believed to allow the deceased to actually interact with the spiritual world. It's fascinating to think about how the Egyptians blended ritual and belief in such a way that even the smallest actions like opening the mouth or offering food had such deep significance. Another curious aspect of these offerings was the inclusion of statues and effigies of the deceased. These figurines, often made from wood or clay, were placed in the tomb to serve as substitutes for the deceased in case their soul became restless or hungry. Some statues were designed to be used in rituals, while others were intended to simply provide comfort and companionship to the spirit. It's a strange and somewhat eerie idea, the thought that these statues could step in and perform the actions the deceased could no longer do. But for the Egyptians, these offerings were crucial in maintaining the balance between the world of the living and the world of the dead. These offerings and rituals weren't just about the physical items placed in the tomb. They were about creating a sense of security and comfort for the deceased. The Egyptians believed that life in the afterlife could be difficult and lonely, so it was important to surround the deceased with everything they might need: food, drink, companionship, and protection. While the mummification process focused on the preservation of the body, the offerings and rituals ensured that the soul would have everything it needed for eternity. And of course, this belief extended to the tomb itself, which was carefully constructed to be a place of peace and protection. Whether it was the elaborate offerings placed in the tomb, the rituals performed for the deceased, or the protection provided by amulets, the ancient Egyptians had an entire system of belief and practice designed to ensure that the deceased would not be left wanting in the afterlife. Historians still debate the full scope of these rituals and offerings. Were they believed to have real magical power, or were they simply symbolic acts meant to comfort the living? Either way, it's clear that the Egyptians went to great lengths to ensure that their dead were cared for in every possible way, from food offerings to ceremonial rituals to the careful preparation of the tomb. As we move forward in the journey of mummification, we find that the tomb wasn't just a resting place for the body, it was also the key to understanding the rituals and beliefs surrounding death in ancient Egypt. The tomb itself was a sacred space, not only serving as the final destination for the body, but also as a place where the deceased could find peace, comfort, and most importantly, a way to connect with the gods. As we explore this deeper, we realise just how significant the tomb was in ensuring the mummified person's successful passage into the afterlife. One of the most fascinating aspects of Egyptian tombs is their design. For the wealthy and powerful, tombs were often grand and elaborate, containing vast amounts of artwork and hieroglyphs, much of which depicted the deceased engaging in various activities from hunting and feasting to working on their lands. These scenes were meant to serve as a kind of user manual for the afterlife, helping the deceased navigate their new existence. Historians still argue about the meaning and function of these tomb paintings. Were they meant to act as a guide for the deceased, or were they simply a way to show off the deceased's wealth and achievements? The truth, it seems, lies somewhere in between. For the commoner, the tomb was often much simpler. However, even these modest tombs were not without significance. At their most basic, they served to house the body and the offerings that the deceased would need in the afterlife. These tombs, though smaller, were still carefully constructed with attention paid to direction, placement, and symbolic meaning. For instance, many tombs faced east where the sun rose, symbolising the deceased's rebirth and their journey toward the afterlife. But even the humblest tombs were often filled with a few simple items, perhaps a piece of pottery, a few food offerings, or a figurine. For the poorer citizens, the tomb's significance wasn't in its wealth or grandeur, but in the spiritual preparation it offered the soul. It's interesting to note that even in these simple tombs, offerings like food and drink were placed inside to ensure the soul's well-being in the afterlife. The fact that the Egyptians thought of even the most humble tombs as crucial to the soul's journey is a testament to how deeply ingrained their beliefs about the afterlife were. It's also important to consider how the tombs were sealed. While many tombs were designed to last for eternity, the Egyptians also faced the unfortunate reality of tomb robbery. Tomb robbers were a common problem, and many royal tombs were plundered in ancient times. So the Egyptians went to great lengths to secure the tombs. Some tombs were sealed with heavy stone slabs, while others were hidden deep within pyramids, far away from the eyes of potential thieves. The tombs of the pharaohs in particular were designed to be nearly impossible to find. They were often buried in secret locations, hidden within a labyrinth of chambers and tunnels, to ensure that their treasures and their souls remained undisturbed. Historians still debate whether the fear of tomb robbery influenced the Egyptian obsession with making tombs so elaborate and difficult to access. Some believe that it was simply about ensuring the safety of the body and the soul, while others think that the Egyptians believed tomb robbers would be punished by the gods. Regardless of the motivation, it's clear that the Egyptians took great care to protect the tombs and the mummified remains inside. The belief in the afterlife was so strong that even the act of sealing the tomb was seen as a powerful ritual. Once the tomb was sealed, the deceased was left to their eternal rest, protected by the gods, surrounded by offerings, and prepared for the long journey ahead. The tomb wasn't just a physical space, it was a spiritual one, a place where the soul could rest, be reborn, and continue its journey to the afterlife. In a way, the tomb was as much a part of the afterlife as the mummified body itself. The tomb is sealed, the rituals completed, and the mummy is now encased in its final resting place. The journey from the embalming table to the tomb has been a long one, full of careful steps and sacred rituals. But now you might wonder what happens after the tomb is sealed and the body is laid to rest. While it may seem like the mummification process would be the last chapter of the story, there's still much more to uncover about how ancient Egyptians viewed their dead and how their mummies have survived for millennia. One of the most iconic moments in mummification history came in 1922 with the discovery of the tomb of King Tutankhamun. This wasn't just another tomb, it was a revelation. Tut's tomb was filled with treasures, gold jewellery, statues, and items meant to ensure the young pharaoh's comfort in the afterlife. The discovery of King Tut's tomb ignited a fascination with ancient Egypt that continues to this day, but it also revealed the immense care that was taken with mummification. Tut's tomb, unlike some others, was undisturbed by robbers. This was a stroke of luck, as most tombs had been looted long before the modern archaeological efforts. King Tut's tomb was filled with priceless artifacts, including his famous gold mask, which continues to captivate people around the world. But what's even more remarkable about King Tut is how his tomb has changed our understanding of mummification. His embalming process, for example, was far more rushed than that of other pharaohs. His body wasn't as carefully prepared as those of other rulers. Some scholars even suggest that his mummification was not completed in the most professional manner, which adds to the mystery of his death. Some believe that he died unexpectedly, leading to a more hurried embalming. Despite the rush, Tut's tomb has remained one of the most significant discoveries in archaeology. The wealth and detail in his tomb have given us unparalleled insight into the process of mummification, as well as the beliefs surrounding it. Through the careful study of Tut's mummified remains, scientists have been able to learn about the physical aspects of mummification, how the body was preserved, the materials used, and the methods that might have been employed. The discovery also shed light on how these ancient rituals evolved over time, particularly during periods of transition and instability in ancient Egypt. Historians still argue over the exact reasons why King Tut's tomb remained so intact, while others were looted. Some speculate that his tomb was hidden deliberately, built to be concealed from robbers, while others believe that the tomb wasn't meant to hold the wealth it did. Nevertheless, the discovery of Tut's tomb was a major turning point in the field of Egyptology, providing researchers with a wealth of knowledge about mummification and ancient Egyptian burial practices. But it's not just King Tut whose tomb has given us insight into mummification. Many other tombs have been uncovered over the years, and with each new discovery, we learn more about the ancient Egyptians' obsession with preserving life, ensuring safety, and preparing the soul for its journey. The tombs and mummies that have survived the centuries offer us a glimpse into a world that's long gone, but continues to captivate our imaginations. Interestingly, the fascination with mummies didn't stop with their discovery. In fact, mummies have been a source of intrigue for centuries. From the early days of exploration to the rise of mummy curses and popular culture, mummies have remained at the forefront of human fascination. Historians still debate whether the ancient Egyptians believed in such curses or if it was simply a modern invention. The allure of mummies has persisted in both scientific research and folklore. The discovery of mummies, especially well-preserved ones, continues to provide valuable information about ancient Egypt's medical practices, beliefs, and daily life. Each mummy tells a unique story, not just of death, but of life. The careful study of mummified remains has revealed a wealth of information about everything from diseases and injuries to diet and social status. It's as if each mummy is a time capsule, preserving a moment from ancient Egypt and allowing modern scientists and historians to piece together a fuller picture of the past. The fascination with mummies doesn't stop with their discovery, and the legacy of mummification continues to evolve today. As modern archaeologists and scientists delve deeper into the study of mummies, they uncover new insights about the ancient Egyptian world. But they also bring us closer to understanding the techniques used by the embalmers who perfected the art of mummification centuries ago. In fact, modern preservation techniques owe a great deal to the innovations of the ancient Egyptians. Despite the thousands of years that separate us from their time, the basic principles of preservation that were developed in ancient Egypt still inform the way we treat and preserve the dead today. One key breakthrough in mummification was the use of chemicals, particularly resins and natron, which prevented decay. These substances didn't just dry out the body, they also played a crucial role in protecting it from bacteria and the harsh elements that could cause decomposition. Natron, a mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, was especially effective in this regard, and its use was so advanced that modern scientists still study it today. It's remarkable to think that ancient Egyptians were so ahead of their time in their understanding of chemistry and preservation. While today's embalming techniques are more advanced, the basic principles of mummification remain surprisingly similar to those of the ancient Egyptians. Moreover, the discovery of mummies in the modern era has also led to a fascinating field of study known as forensic mummification, where researchers try to replicate ancient mummification techniques using modern methods and technologies. By recreating these ancient processes, scientists can gain new insights into how mummification affected the body and how ancient Egyptian embalming rituals shaped the physical and spiritual world. The study of mummies has also contributed to forensic science, in general providing valuable lessons about human anatomy, injury detection, and disease identification. Interestingly, some of the most remarkable mummies that have been discovered in recent years have been those of people from outside of Egypt, but who were caught up in the larger Egyptian sphere of influence. These mummies, often found in Egypt's neighbouring regions like Nubia or the Levant, show that mummification wasn't just a practice for Egyptians themselves. In fact, many cultures in the Mediterranean and beyond adopted aspects of Egyptian burial practices. The influence of Egyptian mummification spread across the ancient world, with different societies adapting the practice to their own needs and beliefs. One fascinating example of this cross-cultural mummification practice comes from the mummies of the ancient Nubians. The kingdom of Kush, located to the south of Egypt, not only adopted the practice of mummification, but also developed its own distinctive methods. These Nubian mummies, often found in tombs near the Egyptian border, have provided valuable insight into the differences in embalming practices between the Egyptians and their neighbours. The use of resins, the placement of the body in tombs, and even the wrapping techniques varied between the two cultures, creating a fascinating contrast that continues to intrigue researchers. There's still so much we don't know about the full range of mummification practices across the ancient world. Some mummies, for instance, have been found in remarkable states of preservation, despite lacking the elaborate embalming rituals seen in Egypt. In some regions, mummification was a natural process rather than a deliberately practiced one, with bodies being preserved due to environmental factors like dry, salty deserts or freezing cold climates. These accidental mummies, found in places like the Andes or Siberia, offer a different perspective on preservation, and in some ways they can provide a clearer picture of what happened to the Egyptian mummies if they were left in less than ideal conditions. Historians and archaeologists still debate the true extent of Egyptian mummification practices. Were they as effective as we believe them to be, or were there unforeseen challenges that modern scientists are only now discovering? For example, some researchers wonder if certain substances used in mummification may have had unintended effects on the body, or whether the embalming process as it evolved was always based on practical knowledge or simply on religious belief. One thing is certain: the quest to understand how the ancient Egyptians preserved their dead continues to uncover new mysteries, even as we're granted a deeper understanding of their world. In fact, the continued study of Egyptian mummies has prompted new technologies that help preserve mummies in ways never before possible. CT scans and other non-invasive imaging techniques allow scientists to peer inside mummies without damaging them, revealing the physical condition of the body, as well as any evidence of disease, trauma, or even the foods they ate. These modern technologies are uncovering new stories about the lives and deaths of ancient Egyptians, stories that were once lost to time. As we move into the realm of modern mummification and the ongoing studies of ancient Egyptian burial practices, it's fascinating to consider the ways in which these ancient rituals still impact our understanding of death preservation and the afterlife. Even today, the legacy of the Egyptians' mummification methods can be seen not just in academic study, but in popular culture, and even in modern embalming techniques. The ancient Egyptians were pioneers in the art of preserving the human body, and although the world has changed dramatically since their time, their contributions still reverberate in ways we don't always recognise. One major aspect that has endured is the concept of preserving the body for eternity. While modern embalming is typically used for funeral services and burial, rather than spiritual protection in the afterlife, the process itself remains remarkably similar to ancient practices. Modern embalmers still use chemicals to disinfect, preserve, and restore the body for viewing, ensuring it stays lifelike for as long as possible. In this sense, modern embalming practices are a direct descendant of the mummification techniques perfected by the ancient Egyptians, who were also motivated by a desire to ensure that the deceased would remain presentable and intact in both the physical and spiritual senses. One interesting modern twist on mummification is the growing interest in green or environmentally conscious burial practices, which focus on allowing the body to decompose naturally rather than using chemicals and artificial preservation techniques. While this may seem like a stark contrast to the elaborate embalming rituals of ancient Egypt, it reflects a different view of the afterlife and death. It's a way of returning the body to the earth without the use of synthetic substances. Yet even in this movement, you can see the echoes of ancient Egyptian thought. The desire to return to nature, to leave behind a legacy, to rest peacefully and be at one with the earth. Another modern fascination with mummies comes from the realm of science fiction and horror. Mummies have long been a staple of supernatural stories, from ancient curses to monstrous revenants rising from their tombs. The mystery surrounding mummies, particularly the famous stories of mummy curses, such as the ones associated with the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, has shaped how we view these ancient remains. Popular culture often presents mummies as cursed, bringing bad luck or misfortune to anyone who disturbs their tomb. While these stories are based more on modern imagination than ancient belief, they illustrate how deeply the concept of mummification has permeated our collective consciousness. However, the most remarkable aspect of modern mummy fascination may be the role that these ancient preserved bodies play in our quest to understand ancient history. Mummies aren't just the subject of stories or movies, they are active participants in the ongoing effort to decode the past. Each mummy tells a story, whether it's of a pharaoh's lavish life or the life of a commoner whose body was preserved for far more practical reasons. Through mummies, scientists have been able to reconstruct ancient diets, diseases, and medical practices. The detailed study of these preserved remains has given us new insights into the daily lives of ancient Egyptians, from the food they ate to the ailments they suffered. And with the help of modern technology like CT scans and DNA analysis, we're able to learn even more about these people who lived thousands of years ago, but whose lives continue to impact us today. Even the most casual observer can see that the field of mummification, ancient or modern, is one filled with unanswered questions. Mummies, by their very nature, are enigmatic. While we have many theories about why the Egyptians embalmed their dead and how they did it, many questions remain. For instance, did the ancient Egyptians have a complete understanding of anatomy and preservation techniques? Or was their process guided more by ritual and belief than by scientific knowledge? How much of their knowledge about preservation was passed down over generations, and how much was lost to time? These questions continue to fuel research, and each new discovery about mummification leads to more questions. Yet as we uncover more about the lives and deaths of the ancient Egyptians, we find that their methods of preservation were astonishingly advanced for their time. As mummies continue to be discovered in tombs across Egypt and beyond, they serve as both artifacts and reminders. These ancient bodies are not just relics of a distant past, they are windows into a civilization that valued the afterlife and the preservation of the self even in death. And while modern science may give us more answers about how mummies were made, there's something timelessly intriguing about the idea of a person preparing for eternity through ritual and belief. Mummification might be an ancient practice, but its legacy is alive today. From modern embalming practices to the stories we tell about mummies, the ancient Egyptians' dedication to preserving the body for the afterlife continues to shape how we think about death preservation and the spiritual journey. As we approach the final stages of this journey through the ancient Egyptian process of mummification, it's worth considering the lasting legacy that these ancient practices have left behind. For over 3,000 years, the mummification process ensured that the ancient Egyptians could take their place in the afterlife with their bodies preserved, their souls protected, and their possessions at hand. But over time, the art of mummification has faded into history, leaving behind only the mummies themselves as proof of its once central role in Egyptian life. And as modern science continues to study these ancient remains, it offers new ways to appreciate the complexities of ancient Egyptian culture. One of the most fascinating aspects of mummification today is how it ties into our understanding of ancient Egyptian religion. The Egyptians' elaborate rituals surrounding death reveal a worldview that was deeply concerned with the preservation of the self. They believed that the soul needed a preserved body to return to in order to live again in the afterlife. But this wasn't just about keeping the body intact, it was about offering a chance at immortality. The deceased was not simply left to rot, they were transformed into something eternal, something that could be reborn in the next world. The Egyptian religious understanding of the afterlife was intertwined with their mummification practices. They believed that the soul would undergo various trials in the afterlife, and that only those who passed these trials could live forever. This process of judgment was essential to their concept of the afterlife, and it was in the embalming and mummification process that the deceased was equipped to face the trials ahead. The Book of the Dead, which we discussed earlier, was a guide for the soul's journey, offering spells and prayers that would protect the deceased from the dangers of the underworld. These beliefs were so ingrained in Egyptian society that they affected every part of their burial rituals, from the architecture of the tombs to the symbolic amulets placed on the body. It's almost poetic to think about the way the Egyptians viewed the journey to the afterlife, not as an end, but as a continuation of life itself. Death was seen as a transition to a new form of existence, and mummification was the means by which this transition could take place. The belief in a continued existence after death is one that resonates with many cultures throughout history, but few societies went to such lengths to ensure their dead were cared for so thoroughly. However, historians still debate the spiritual and theological motives behind mummification. Were the ancient Egyptians purely motivated by religious devotion, or was the desire for immortality driven more by the human need for legacy and remembrance? Some argue that mummification was an act of preserving the legacy of the deceased, ensuring that their memory would live on for generations. Others believe that it was more of a communal act performed not only for the benefit of the deceased, but for the society as a whole. In either case, the fact that mummification was such a deeply ingrained part of Egyptian culture speaks to the importance of death memory and the spiritual journey in their worldview. While mummification may seem like an arcane and distant practice, it serves as a reminder of the human desire for continuity, remembrance and protection values that transcend time and culture. The art of mummification, with all its rituals and beliefs, tells us more about the ancient Egyptians' views on death than any written document could. It shows that they viewed the afterlife not as a distant abstract concept, but as a very real and tangible part of life, a part worth preparing for with great care and precision. In modern times, we may no longer practice mummification, but we still wrestle with similar existential questions. What happens after we die? How can we preserve our memories, our legacies, our essence? These are questions that we just, like the ancient Egyptians, continue to ponder. But in our quest for answers, it's worth remembering that the ancient Egyptians were perhaps the first to give death such careful consideration. They recognized that the transition to the afterlife was one of the most important events in a person's life, and devoted themselves entirely to ensuring that the dead had everything they needed for their journey. Mummification wasn't just a method of preserving bodies, it was an expression of the Egyptian belief in the eternal nature of the soul. Even as the world around them changed, as empires rose and fell, the mummification process remained a constant and enduring symbol of their dedication to the afterlife. And while we may never fully understand the extent of the Egyptians' belief in the afterlife, we can certainly appreciate the care and reverence with which they treated their dead. And so we come to the final chapter of our journey into the world of mummification. The journey that began with the careful embalming and wrapping of the body has taken us through the sacred rituals, the amulets, the tombs, and the beliefs that shaped one of the most fascinating and enduring practices in human history. As we reflect on the Egyptians' approach to death, we see that their commitment to ensuring that the deceased would live on in the afterlife was not just about preserving the body, it was about preserving the soul, the essence of the person who once lived. But as we close the tomb on our exploration, we're left with a sense of mystery. Even though modern science has unravelled much about how the ancient Egyptians mummified their dead, there are still so many unanswered questions. What exactly did the Egyptians believe about the afterlife? How much of their mummification process was driven by religious fervour, and how much was practical? Historians still debate the full significance of mummification rituals, the role of amulets, and whether the Egyptians truly believed that mummification could guarantee immortality, or if it was simply a way to honour the deceased and provide for their comfort in the afterlife. What we do know is this: the ancient Egyptians were deeply invested in the idea that death was not an end, but a transition. They believed that the journey to the afterlife was as important as the life that came before it. The mummification process was not just about preserving the body, it was about ensuring that the soul would have a safe passage through the afterlife with all the necessary protection, nourishment, and spiritual guidance. It was a complex system of ritual spells and protections, all designed to ensure that the deceased would not be forgotten, that they would continue to exist in some form, and that they would be at peace. As the years go by and mummies continue to be uncovered in tombs across Egypt, we find that the legacy of these ancient practices is far from over. Mummies continue to offer us glimpses into a past that is long gone, but whose influence still lingers. The discovery of mummies has helped us better understand not only ancient Egyptian culture, but also human nature itself. The desire for immortality, for preservation, for legacy, these are desires that transcend time, culture, and geography. The Egyptians may have been the first to perfect the art of mummification, but they were not the last to ask the same questions about death and the afterlife. And as we think about the mummies we've encountered in our journey, we are reminded of the ancient Egyptians' enduring belief that death was not an end, but a transformation, a continuation. While we may not share their beliefs, we can't help but admire their dedication to ensuring that the deceased were not forgotten, that their memory would endure, and that they would be prepared for whatever awaited them beyond this life. In many ways, their approach to death reflects the best of human nature, the desire to leave a legacy, to be remembered, to be at peace. So as we reach the end of our exploration into the world of Egyptian mummies, we can reflect on what they have to teach us. Whether it's about the rituals that mark the passage from life to death, the care with which we treat our loved ones, or the ways in which we remember those who have gone before us, the legacy of mummification is one of reverence, of preservation, and of connection. The mummies may rest in tombs for thousands of years, but the lessons they carry are eternal. Now, with the final wrapping of this tale, let your mind slowly unwind and drift to where the ancient Egyptians hoped their souls would travel into a peaceful eternity. Perhaps like the mummies themselves, the memories of those we love can live on, protected, preserved, and never forgotten. As you close your eyes and let the story settle into your mind, remember that, just as the ancient Egyptians ensured their dead were cared for, we too find ways to care for those we leave behind, creating legacies that outlast us.